Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. Well, as promised, here's my deeper dive into the contents of the new Doctor Who Blu-ray release, Season 7 on Blu-ray. Hello there, my name is Paul Mount. You're very welcome to my world of stuff. You might have seen my unboxing of the new Season 7 Doctor Who Blu-ray box set, which has come out this week. And I did an unboxing and showed you what it looks like and so on and so on. And people seem to like that video. And as I did promise, I would come back and talk about the set in more depth when I've had a chance to look at it all. Here we are doing that very thing. I have had a chance now to look at a lot of the contents of this set. I spent most of Tuesday, in fact, working my way through the special features and sampling the episode, and as I expected, getting drawn into the stories and very much wanting to spend time watching the stories as much as the special features. So I have sampled the episodes, and I will go back and watch all the episodes, which, as I said in my previous video, I don't always do with these Doctor Who sets, because certainly the later episodes, later seasons of Doctor Who aren't of the same quality, should we say, and aren't as appealing to me, but I just love the special features, and that's what always draws me into these sets. I know a few people in the comments for my last video said that they tend to be selective and buy their favourite seasons of the show, and I completely understand that. But as a completist, I feel I want them all. And I think if the later season didn't have new documentaries and interesting ways of looking at Doctor Who, I probably wouldn't have bought anything after Peter Davison, really, because they're on my shelf and I can't see me bringing them out again. But I've enjoyed watching the new special features. A friend of mine earlier this week said that he wasn't really interested in these box sets because he'd moved on from classic Doctor Who and he was tired of the same old anecdotes and things. But I tried to point out to him that these sets don't do that. These sets shy away from doing the obvious stuff about Doctor Who that we as fans know. We know the history of how these episodes were made. We know all the anecdotes. We know the eye patch anecdote that Nicholas Courtney wheeled out for years. These sets don't do that. The sets now, the special features, focus on something different. They focus on people, finding out more about people we don't know a lot about, and they look at Doctor Who from a slightly different angle. They put different perspectives on the show, and that's what this set does, particularly with some of its special features. It's Season 7. It's my favourite Doctor Who season of all time. As I said in my unboxing video, I'll repeat it here because it bears repeating. I adore this season because it's Doctor Who doing Quatermass, it's Doctor Who grounded, Jon Pertwee's the third Doctor, flamboyant with his frills and his capes, very much an action man type figure, very sophisticated figure, very commanding figure. You look at Pertwee on screen and he is the Doctor, you know he's the Doctor, because he has that look about him, he has that silhouette, he has the costume, the clothes, and as I keep on saying, it's my problem with the current Doctor, Ncuti Gatwa, that he is a clothes horse. We never see him in the same thing twice. So you know he's the Doctor, but he doesn't have that defining image, which I think a Doctor needs. Jon Pertwee has it in spades. He looks fantastic. He, as Tom Baker used to say, he's like a tall light bulb. He flickers and he glows and he explodes out of the screen, to be honest. He owns this character from the moment he appears. And I think of all the Doctors that we've had on TV, he arrives fully formed, and I know in his first story he's suffering from a bit of trauma from his regeneration. But once he clicks into his new persona, it's there. He is this character. Throughout his 5-year run, that performance never weakens. It's never diluted. He remains this character, even though he gets visibly older as the series goes on and his hair gets a bit bigger. He's still this Doctor, and I absolutely love that. And this is why Jon Pertwee is my favourite classic Doctor. And again, I've said this before, Tom Baker, brilliant as he is and iconic as he is, and how so many people associate Doctor Who with him. I think because he stayed on so long and his performance got a little sloppy and too comedic. Tom Baker in his first 3 seasons, magnificent. After that, it gets a bit more hit and miss. But Jon Pertwee, spot on all the way through. Regardless of the fact that I think, his 5th series is a little bit frayed around the edges in a production sense, but that's not down to Jon Pertwee, who gave it his all the way through. So this is a magnificent series. It is willfully inspired by Quatermass. That was very much the intention when they crafted this series. The Doctor was stuck on Earth, having been exiled there by the Time Lords. He can't get off Earth, so he's involved in scientific mysteries, strange things that are going on, alien creatures coming to Earth, creatures underneath the earth. It's very much based on that ethos of Quatermass, and the Doctor is the Quatermass of these stories. If there's any criticism of the stories, I suppose, is that 3 of them take place in bases, big facilities, a space centre, a nuclear facility, a drilling project. But that, for me, makes it even more realistic and more adult and more contemporary, because it's all about science. I mean, people complain about Doctor Who having issues and finger wagging, but he was doing it here. Many of these stories are about man is the enemy. There's a couple of stories where you've got creatures, you've got the Silurians, you've got the ambassadors from Mars, and they appear to have malevolent intent, but only because humanity has malevolent intent towards them. The ambassadors are exploited. The Silurians are the original owners of Earth, and they are now in combat with mankind that is terrified of them and won't work with them. So it's interesting that it has these points to make about the nature of humanity. And I think that a lot of fans who criticise modern Doctor Who for its lecturing and its wokeism don't understand that Doctor Who is always like that. It's always had a story to tell beneath the story, a moral, if you like, a point to make. It's not just about monsters and gun battles and running around corridors. Doctor Who has a lot to say about the human condition, and I think this season does it as well as any. Anyway, the stories then. And I'll talk about the stories and how they look, because of course they're on Blu-ray and we expect the best quality picture from Blu-ray. We don't necessarily get that with this set for various reasons. Spearhead from Space, of course. This has been out on Blu-ray before, and this is the only Doctor Who story that was fully shot on film. It wasn't intended to be that way. It was intended to adapt the usual location filming and studio-based recording video material at Television Centre, but there was industrial dispute. The whole story had to be mounted on film, and it benefits from that so much. As I said in my unboxing, I remember watching this in 1970, and it suddenly seemed big and glossy. Even at that age, I was aware that Doctor Who was sort of slightly tacky in the 60s, certainly in terms of its production, and a bit clunky, but this was suddenly glossy and new. As somebody who'd watched things like Batman and the Irwin Allen films and the ITC films and series, I could tell the difference, even then at that age, between something that was glossy and on film and something that was not quite the same. So Spearhead from Space looks gorgeous. I think it's been remastered again. I've never seen it look better than it does on this. It's glorious, beautiful, and it's very contemporary. And even though there are things that date it, still a very modern story. It's very fast-paced. We know Spearhead from Space. You don't need me to remind you of the story. But it is, I'm going to say, it's the best first story for a Doctor of the entire history of Doctor Who. Old Doctor Who and new Doctor Who. It's absolutely wonderful in the clever way it repositions the series and the Doctor in this new environment. A beautifully put together story that just works so well with a great script from Robert Holmes, and it looks fantastic. The other 3 stories, Doctor Who and the Silurians, the Ambassadors of Death and Inferno, they do suffer in comparison because obviously they don't have that same quality. There are film sequences, there are lots of studio material, but of course the issue with all 3 stories is that the BBC didn't have them all in colour in the archives. And over the years they've come back, black and white copies that the BBC had. There have been copies that have come from abroad in slightly washed out colour. I'm not going to go into all the technicalities of how they did this, mainly because I don't understand it, but they have over the years beefed these episodes up. They've used this incredible technology. They blended the colour images from the washed out recordings from Canada or Australia, and they blended those with black and white to create a colour image. And then they have had this chroma dot technique where they've drawn colour out of the black and white image to recreate as best as they can the original colour image. The main issue, I think, is that the broadcast standards are different abroad. It's not as pinpoint sharp, regardless of any colour additions that have been put on. So it doesn't have that sharpness of quality. You do notice that. You look at Spearhead from Space with zings, and these 3 following serials, which look better than I've ever seen them now. They're as close to broadcast quality as we're going to see them. But there is a slight sense that the image isn't as crisp as Spearhead from Space, because it isn't. However, these are the best I've ever seen, these stories. Inferno is my favourite story of all time. It looks great. There's some really sharp, clear images. Some of the exterior stuff sometimes is a bit fuzzy. Some of it is fuzzy, I think, is a technical expression for some of the images because of that difference in the broadcast standards abroad. And as much as they've done all they can to make these look great, I would say these look great. Spearhead from Space looks fantastic. I think if you get hold of this set, you'd be a fool if you don't. You will notice the difference, but you will also notice that these 3 stories are the best they've ever looked, and probably the best that they ever will. I don't think you could do much more to restore these unless the original tapes are suddenly found, which isn't going to happen after all these years. So you won't be disappointed by them. You will notice the difference, but I think if you're a long-term fan and you know the history of these reconstructions and so on, you will think, wow, these look great. But you will have to accept, as we all do, that Spearhead on film is always going to look better. Honestly, I was so impressed by the work done on these stories to make them look 85% of the original standard when they were released in 1970. So that's my blundering description of the quality of the episodes. Let's take a look at the new special features, which are always the USP of these sets. And there are lots of good things on this set, which I spent a lot of time really enjoying. And I'll go through them in the order that I watched them. The first feature I watched is called Looking for Mac. This is a 40-minute documentary hosted by Toby Hadoke, who is, of course, the Doctor Who fan who does lots of material on these sets. He wants to find out about Malcolm Hulke, who wrote Doctor Who and the Silurians. He was also involved in script doctoring for the Ambassadors of Death, because there were problems with the original script there. And of course he wrote later stories like Colony in Space, Invasion of the Dinosaurs, The Sea Devils. He wrote a lot of really good, solid John Pertwee Doctor Who stories. And of course he'd worked on things like the War Games with Terence Dicks for the last Troughton season. This is a fascinating documentary because, like most of us, I don't really know anything about Mark Hulke, apart from the fact that he's called Malcolm Hulke, and he had communist leanings. Toby Hadoke has really dug deep into finding out a little bit more by referencing historical interviews and making contact with people who knew him and were associated with him and worked with him and had friendships with him. It's a very melancholy little documentary, actually, because he was a bit of a loner. He had a flat, he had an apartment that he lived in, but there's no record of him having a relationship or a family of his own. I think he had a difficult childhood, but he wanted to write. And across this documentary, Toby Hadoke speaks to people who knew him, as I say, worked with him, and give a bit more light and shade and colour to this man that's just a name on the credits to so many of us. But as I say, it is quite sad because he died very young, in his 50s, 1979, from cancer. He was a chain smoker. And it's the story of a man who probably felt he hadn't achieved what he wanted to achieve, despite his fame in the world of Doctor Who and having written lots of TV stuff. He wrote for the Avengers in the 1960s. He was probably frustrated that for whatever reason he hadn't quite done what he wanted to do. So it does come across as melancholy is the word, really, because it's a life that's slightly frustrating, certainly for the person who lived it. What's interesting particularly about this film is that there are 2 people that I know and I have met who are interviewed in the video. There's Richard Bates, who is the producer of The Tripods, who I met and spent some time talking to when I visited the location for the 2nd season of The Tripods in 1985. Nice to see him again. And also, much to my surprise, at the very end of the video, Toby Hadoke goes to a pub in South London and meets a chap called Gary Hopkins, who interviewed Malcolm Hulke back in the 70s, shortly before he passed away. Now, I still regard Gary as a friend, haven't seen him for years. Gary and I and another chap called Tim, we used to work on fanzines back in the 70s, and we created a couple of Doctor Who fanzines. And Gary in particular would contact Doctor Who alumni who were still alive at the time, people like Dennis Spooner and Brian Hales, David Whittaker and Malcolm Hulke, and he contacted them and interviewed so many of them. And his archive of interviews is vital and essential because they're pretty much the only interviews that these people did. And this was all at the time when Doctor Who fandom was starting to probe the history of Doctor Who and investigate how the show came together. And so many of these people who were there at the beginnings of Doctor Who and in its early days and in its prime were still alive. It's harder now, of course, because most of these people sadly have passed away. But it's nice to see Gary talking to Toby, and he dug out his original tapes and has converted them into digital. And it was nice to hear Malcolm Hulke's voice. That was something Toby particularly wanted to do because he said, I found out a lot more about him, I know more about him, but I don't know what he sounds like. And it's just nice to see an old friend of mine being interviewed by Toby at the end of this documentary. So a really nice documentary. Second one I watched is called Splendid Chap, The Life and Times of Nicholas Courtney. Of course, the legendary Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. Long overdue, this sort of feature, which by and large I enjoyed. There are some problems, I think, with some of the creative decisions in the way the story is presented. It's hosted by John Culshaw. He now does the voice of the Brigadier for Big Finish Audios. And there are some odd choices that made it a bit of an uneven viewing for the first half an hour. I thought, I'm not particularly happy with this. That's just purely my opinion. John Culshaw slips into his voice for the Brigadier at points. And there are extracts from Nicholas Courtney's book, Still Getting Away With It. And John Culshaw does the voice of Nicholas Courtney reading from the book. And he also, because he's John Culshaw, he can't help it. He slips into doing his Tom Baker and his John Pertwee. And at one point, he's Roger Delgado. And I just didn't think this was the time and place for that sort of thing, really, because it's a serious documentary about somebody who's no longer with us, who was much beloved by the Doctor Who community. I didn't think it was the place for John Culshaw to show off his impersonations. There was also another bit where Nicholas Courtney worked for the famous, but now largely forgotten, theatrical impresario Donald Wolfett. And they cast an actor to play Donald Wolfett, and they cast an actor to play young Nicholas Courtney. And they tried to reconstruct some of the interactions that they had behind the scenes on stage. And I found that a little bit cack-handed and a little bit embarrassing, to be honest. I didn't need that. They told us that there was this relationship, professional relationship, and that was enough. I didn't need to see actors hamming it up. And there was quite a bit of this the first 20-25 minutes. I thought, I hope they're not going to do this all the way through, because I want to know about Nicholas Courtney. I don't want to see all this stuff. Fortunately, that fell away after a while, and it became a more straightforward look at his life, talking to his family, his sister, his son, various people who worked with him over the years, and it got into the more familiar rhythm. So yeah, in the end, I really enjoyed it. And of course, it's very sad at the end, because he suffered quite a lot in his last couple of years with ill health. But it's generally a very good documentary. It's just those first 20 minutes I found a bit of a slog and a bit, I don't like this. But all in all, it's enjoyable, and it tells you a lot about Nicholas Courtney. Things I didn't know about his background, his very privileged background, I suppose you would call it. But no, it's a very good documentary, but just be wary of those first 20 minutes. Then I watched the Matthew Sweet interview with John Levene, about 65 minutes. I was intrigued by this because John Levene is famously a divisive figure in Doctor Who. He wears his heart on his sleeve, I think it's fair to say. And in fact, I think I said to a friend of mine, pretty much all his internal organs on his sleeve. He has no real filter. He says it and tells it like it is. And I know a lot of people in the past have had some difficult encounters with him, because I think he is probably quite volatile in places. But after watching this interview, he's very emotional. He's quick to tear up at memories of certain things, because Doctor Who for him was a very special time in his life. He's not a trained actor. He was an extra. He was picked out of the crowd by Douglas Camfield, who spotted something in him and gave him a chance. It was not the sort of thing that would happen these days. He was plucked out of the pool of extras and given a few lines, became Benton, who was written more and more into the series. And he had a naturalism to his acting, which made Benton a likeable, lovable sort of character. And this performance was always very good. He was always a background character. He never had a major storyline, obviously, but he had his moments in the sun now and again. And John Levene has never forgotten the people who put him where he ended up. And he appreciates his position in Doctor Who. And he's very emotional about the people who've passed, the people who gave him chances. People like John Pertwee. He gets very emotional at the thought of him not being around, and Nick Courtney and various other people. He had a difficult childhood, as so many of these people did. And he fought through adversity to make something of himself when nobody thought he would, and he didn't think he would. It's a really nice piece, and he comes across very well. I know he doesn't always, as I say, I know people who are very wary of him because they've had or have heard of issues that he's had in the past. But I think here it's a nice little piece that presents him in a decent light, which is what these documentaries are for. And as I said, with the Pertwee era, there's him and Katie Manning are the only ones left from the main cast now. She's done a piece, I think, on one of the earlier sets, and it's nice to have John Levene, who is now 83, incidentally. This was recorded in 2021. And it's interesting that they are getting these things done, ready for future sets, because, people are going to be around forever, so you have to catch them while they're alive. But it's a nice piece. I really enjoyed watching it. I also enjoyed a short piece called Terror of the Suburbs. Again, this is what I mean about not just actors recounting the old eye patch gags and all the stories and anecdotes we've heard so many times before. It's looking at Doctor Who in a slightly different way, and contemporising this era of Doctor Who and looking at the world around it at the time. And this piece, Terror of the Suburbs, again, is hosted by Matthew Sweet, and he's looking at how Doctor Who in this era came down to earth and became suburban and became real world. And it starts off with a very interesting section where He's in Ealing High Street, where that famous scene at the end of Spearhead from Space takes place, where the Autons awaken, come crashing out of the shop window, creates that iconic Doctor Who image. And he's back there on that location, which hasn't changed enormously, you can recognise it. And he's there with one of the location's managers from modern Doctor Who. And they're talking about how that scene would have been filmed and how it was done. It would have been filmed on a Sunday morning when shops weren't open. And the issues that they would have had in putting it together, and editing sequences that were done at different times. It's really fascinating to see. And then Matthew runs with that idea of Doctor Who filming on the streets and how it had that sort of contemporary look in suburbia. And he speaks to different people who have different views of how Doctor Who reflects that sort of thing. And that's interesting because it isn't just, I remember filming this and doing that. It's looking at it at a slightly different angle. It's a really interesting piece. I also enjoyed a 50-minute piece called Lucky 13, which is comedian Robin Ince looking at the relationship with science and Doctor Who. And that again is very interesting because Doctor Who and science, you don't think so much of science fiction with Doctor Who now, particularly the current Who, which is more sort of fantasy and supernatural. And I'm not entirely sure that works. But Doctor Who's relationship with science, and it was always a thing in Doctor Who, there's a scientific explanation for everything. And he looks at how Doctor Who reflected contemporary science without the audience really knowing it. Cybernetics, for example, with the Cybermen, Ambassadors of Death on this set, which was broadcast around the time of the Apollo 13 mission, of course, which went disastrously wrong. And there's fascinating archive clips, which I've not seen before, from the BBC archives, the news archives of when Apollo 13 was trying to make its way back to Earth and how it was being reported. And Doctor Who reflecting all these things. There's loads of examples of Doctor Who mirroring science. There's a clip from The Demons where the Doctor's got Bessie and he's showing Joe Grant that there's science, not magic, and he's using his remote control to make Bessie move independently. And then he flashes to a contemporary scene from a BBC documentary which is about driverless cars. Not the driverless cars that we're familiar with today. These were slightly more tram-like cars operated by electricity going through the ground underneath. It would have been an enormous undertaking to dig up roads and put electrical tram lines under the roads. And perhaps most tellingly, there's a clip of Kit Pedler, the creator of the Cybermen and Doomwatch, talking about technology. And it's fascinating to watch that because it was done in the 1960s. And he's talking about AI, effectively. He doesn't call it AI, but he's talking about machines and computers becoming more sentient and taking over from man and making man redundant. And these are the sort of issues that we're talking about today very seriously, and people are concerned about AI, concerned about machine technology. And it's just fascinating to see how Doctor Who, as always, I think really dealt with those sorts of issues and presented them years before we as members of the public realised that these are actually real things and potentially things that could affect our lives. Fascinating. It's a really interesting piece. And I wasn't sure going in. I thought it might be a bit sort of hectoring and lecturing and boring, but there's some really nicely judged clips. Robin Ince hosts it from the Leicester Space Centre, which I've earmarked now as a place I want to visit this year. And he puts it all into that setting and creates a real narrative from it. It's excellent. The final new special feature, and two I suppose, there's a Doctor Who escape room with Team Third Doctor. I haven't watched that. It's not my sort of thing, escape rooms and stuff like that. I may look at it at some point, but it doesn't really appeal to me. There are movie editions of The Silurians, Doctor Who and The Silurians, and Inferno. I've looked at The Silurians, but I've actually watched that. Very good. It's interesting how you can boil a 7-part story down into a 90-minute story, and it keeps the flow of the story very well. I know there's been issues with the War Games and the Daleks, which came out over the last couple of years on BBC 4. But this is how you do something like that. They're both about 100 minutes long, so it's a bit longer to breathe. But there's a lot more story. But of course, with these stories, there is, famously, the stories are probably too long. The episodes, there's 7 episodes to stories that don't need them. But as 90, 100-minute episodes, they actually work very well and rattle along very well. Haven't watched the Inferno one yet, but I've watched the Silurians. It's very good. The only other special feature to mention then is the Behind the Sofa regular features. I have to say I do think these have run their course now because they're things you watch once, but they're a bit tiresome. You've got modern Doctor Who alumni in this. You've got Katie Manning and Matthew Waterhouse. I'll go back to them in a minute. You've got Janet Fielding, Sarah Sutton and Sophie Aldred. And you've got Toby Hidoki, Carolyn John's daughter Daisy and her husband Jeffrey Beavers watching these episodes and talking about them. By and large, they're sort of, take them or leave them. And I sort of feel I've seen enough of this now. Particularly this one, Katie Manning and Matthew Wardhouse. Matthew Wardhouse, bless him, is so irritating. Now, Matthew Wardhouse is a Doctor Who super fan. He watched Doctor Who as a kid. He knew Doctor Who like the back of his hand, and he got to work in the programme. But he's watching these episodes with Katie Manning, and he's shouting and screaming and rolling. Oh my God, look at that. That's such a... He knows what's going to happen in these episodes. He's pretending he doesn't. And he's over-egging it a little bit. And he's really playing to the camera in ways that just become a bit sort of, shut up, Matthew, as you go along. The rest of them, I think the ones with Toby Hidoki are quite good because he's a bit jokey about it as well. He points out, as you do, that shortcomings in maybe plot holes and production issues and things. But he knows about Doctor Who, and he's very good because he's with Caroline John, who plays Liz Shaw, her daughter, who now plays Liz Shaw for Big Finish, and Geoffrey Beavers, who is her husband. And he sort of gets little memories from them, particularly Geoffrey Beavers, about Caroline John filming these episodes. And it's nice for them to get to see these. So he keeps it on a even keel. The Janet Fielding, Sarah Sutton, Sophie Aldred, well, these are people who've not seen these stories before. They get shown edited versions, so I don't know how easy it is for them to follow, particularly these stories, which are quite densely packed and complex. But they don't have anything interesting to say, really. Just, I get a sense with all of these that they're trying to outdo each other and trying to be funny and entertain one another. That's not hugely entertaining to watch. So I'm a bit tired of these features, but I suppose we're going to keep on getting them because they sort of fill up the space. As well as that, of course, you've got all the usual stuff that was on the previous DVD releases. I have looked at one or two of those, actually. This is such an important season for me. I dipped into some of those to see them again. So, all in all, it's a terrific set. I do like all the special features. A couple of, caveats to the Nicholas Courtney one and the Behind the Sofas, but generally, really fascinating, well-made documentaries. And again, reminds us how lucky we are to have Doctor Who treated so well by the BBC and the people who put these things together. So many shows, if they get a physical release at all, just get them with electronic press kit material or nothing at all. And we get stuff which really puts Doctor Who in its contemporary perspective. And I think that when every season of Doctor Who is done, it's going to be the last word in Doctor Who presented pictorially and in terms of chronicling its history and its place in popular culture. Absolutely superb. If you haven't bought it yet, don't be a fool. If you're a Doctor Who fan, you need to have this. It's the very best of classic Doctor Who, presented so well and with really interesting, sympathetic special features. It's just a must-have. And it gets a 10 out of 10, by the way. Obviously a 10 out of 10. It's terrific stuff. Right, thank you for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you are new here, and a lot of people are new, please stick around, like and subscribe. Very important to subscribe. And once again, I'll make the point that 65% of viewers of my videos lately are not subscribers. Why aren't you subscribers? Just click the button. Come on. How many times do I have to tell you? Just click the button, subscribe. You don't have to watch them all. There may be things you're not interested in. I fully understand you might not be interested in everything. And apologies for there being a lot of Doctor Who content this week. It's a big week with this box set coming out. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Get one of these t-shirts if you're interested in wandering around the streets with keep taking the stuff all over your chest area. And I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.